Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists, welcome to this panel on the smaller states in the global affairs. In the title, saying smaller states, I thought was quite interesting. I usually deal with issues of small states. My name is Pia Hansson. I'm director of the Center for Small State Studies, which is part of the Institute of International Affairs and is actually a part of the University of Iceland. So I am not a government official and maybe can therefore ask all kinds of strange and difficult questions to the panelists. First up, I'd like to say thank you so much for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be here in Bled. I must say this is about the greatest setting one can imagine for discussing any kinds of issues. And I'm sure it makes it easier to be in this kind of a situation. The power of smaller states in global affairs is a big issue, I would think, because there are so many states that actually can be defined as smaller states. And actually, if you want to take it that far, you can say we're all smaller than China, right? So although we do have representatives here in the panel representing populations from 35,000 up to 17 million, that actually is quite a bit of a difference in population size. We'd also like to discuss, does that really matter? Is population size something that we want to be looking at? Or is maybe the whole notion of smaller states something more on perceptions? So we'll see what the panelists have to say. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you the three panelists we have, but first let me mention that the Minister for Foreign Affairs from Iceland, who was supposed to be here, could not make the flight last night, so if there are any issues dealing with Iceland, I will try humbly to answer those. Let me begin by introducing to my right, Minister Moreno from Chile. He has, I believe, a degree in MBA, an MBA degree from the University of Chicago, and has been involved quite a bit in business, sits on the boards of many companies. On his right, we have Minister Frick from Liechtenstein. She has a PhD degree in law, a lawyer by trade, so that will be very interesting to hear what you have to say. I guess you've also been self-employed, worked in consultancy and management. And on her right, we have Mr. Rocha from Verde. He's state secretary, and he has a long-standing career in government service. I believe 29 years, if that's correct, Mr. Rocha. So before we move further on, I would like to give our panelists a chance to give us a presentation. Oh, we get daylight, that's good.
To see each other.
Yes. Yes, very good. Oh. Are we okay? This is not good?
Yeah, I don't know what. I'm sorry about this.
It's fine. Having worked in broadcasting, I know what technical difficulties are. Better? Hey, let's give them applause here. This is a tough situation. Well, moving over to Minister Moreno, we'd like to hear your presentation. You have about 5 minutes each, and then after that we will have an open discussion. We'll, of course, want to involve you all as much as possible. So please listen carefully and write down whatever questions or comments you may have, and wave, and I will recognize you afterwards. But on to you, Minister Moreno.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be in this so lovely place. I'm sorry that I have only the opportunity to be here for some hours, but I'll come again because it's a very lovely place. Just to go to the subject, we received a scenario paper with some thoughts of Professor Nye. And I thought that that was really something which is exactly to the point. Professor Knight said that there is a three-dimensional chessboard on political power, which is on power, which is one, a military one, where the power remains highly concentrated, an economic board, where power is shared among many players, including, of course, many vigorous and emerging countries, and then a decentralized one, where the main players are non-state actors. Maybe it's by chance, but two ministers here are coming from business instead of from the government. And today, if globalization and interdependence is what we're seeing in the world, I would say that the diplomacy of that globalization is multilateralism. And I see many people from the embassies, and that doesn't mean that we have to work less, because we just go to the meetings of the multilateral organization. Just the opposite. We have to work much more, because we have to have relationship with many more countries, so the minister from Chile has to come to Slovenia, which was not the case many years ago. And so I was asked to give a couple of key messages and then a question. So my first message would be that this multilateral diplomacy has a growing role in this new world. And in that front, smaller states are much more than in the bilateral arena. Moreover, the very idea of small states is something that we have to put into test when we introduce regional and sub-regional arrangements that all of those countries have. How small was Luxembourg in the Benelux context? How small is Trinidad and Tobago, which is a very small country, among the Caribbean countries? And how small was the impact of Tunisia, with a 0.15% in the world population in the Arab Spring? How small is Palestine in the next General Assembly of the UN in a few days? So the very idea of small states in this new world is something that is getting changed. Every country has a vote. And this is also something that increases the security of small states, because small states cannot rely on their diplomatic strength or their armed forces to defend themselves. But now they can rely on a strong set of multilateral organizations that will help, will not be something absolute, but they will help to prevent the use of weapons by other larger states. So that's one point. Let me try to introduce a second one, which is that even being that true, to be relevant, small states cannot rely on multilateralism or, for that, on international law. They also need to make a very strong decision, which is to make really serious and political, economical policies. Very large countries can make mistakes and live with that for a long time. We have seen that a lot in the last years. They cannot stand that forever, but they can do it for a very long time. But smaller ones cannot. What are these duties? This duty starts with having their own house in order. The global negative impact of domestic conflict, for example, cannot be overemphasized. If you look at Afghanistan, Somalia, Haiti, and many others, you see that the main point is to have your own house in order. Moreover, no small country can have or exercise influence in global affairs if it doesn't have a strong democracy, a sound fiscal management, a solid development strategy. Small states also need good credentials in transparency and accountability. This is the only way that we can have a lasting social peace and stability within our own countries. And that's the basic ground to pretend to have a voice in regional and, moreover, in world affairs. The economists say that the best use for economic resources is to use them on the comparative advantages of a country. And they also say that every country has a comparative advantage. I think that in the political arena and international fields, we have the same case. The best possible use of our political resources when we are a small state is to focus them where we need them the most and where we can make a difference. Let me tell you in a few words the case of Chile. In the case of Chile, for example, we opened the economy many years ago, and we are one of the countries with more trade agreements in the world. The average import tariff in Chile is 0.8%, and trade represents more than 70% of the GNP of the country. So what we do is that we concentrate our efforts in promoting free trade in every forum we can, and we promote FTAs with every major country or every region in the world. The same is true, for example, in human rights. In the human rights arena, we had a very tough experience in the 70s and 80s. But we overcome that in a just and peaceful way that allowed the country to reunite after that. So we use that experience in the international field, supporting all efforts to promote human rights around the world, including being, of course, a member of the UN Human Rights Council, recently re-elected. The miners rescue that I assume that most of you saw was an example of the value of we put in human life and in its defense. And those efforts, free trade, human rights, have made Chile widely recognized and respected on a much higher degree than what its size deserves. So that's my second message. Small countries will receive no gifts. Nothing will give you nothing for free. They have to earn their position among world states. And the only way for that are serious and sound internal policies, plus a focused and stable action on the international arena based on carefully analyzed advantages of your own country. I already said that every country has a comparative advantage. The difference in outcome when we assess the history of small states seems to lie in the way in which they have used those opportunities. Take, for instance, the case of Haiti. At the beginning of the 19th century, Haiti was the richest colony in America. Even France relinquished Louisiana, which at that point was maybe 20% or a third of the US, which was larger in size, but less than Haiti at the moment, in order to retain Haiti. And today Haiti is the only LDC, the only least developed country in the Americas. On the contrary, today Chile, which was a frontier military post, which was the poorest among the Spanish colonies, enjoys today the highest income per capita in Latin America. Let me go to the question now, just to finish. And it's something which relates to the fact that, for example, the population of Chile is 17 million, Slovenia something around 2 million. You told me that the population of your country was 35,000, so there's something that I would like to put on you as a question, which is, when we talk about small countries, we normally are thinking about small population, small territory, but both territory and population are relative categories, as you can see in this panel. Let us take territory, for example. My country is known to be exceptionally long, but very narrow. And we think about that because we are in the wide of Chile is between 200 and 400 kilometers. But Israel is 35 kilometers. And when we turn to population, Chile triples the population of Singapore and more than doubles the population of Israel. But nevertheless, Israel ranks very high in technological development and, of course, in military power. And Singapore is a trading giant, harboring the largest maritime transportation hub in the world. So the question would be, could it be that the difference between big and small is really related not to the possibility to be important in a specific field, but really related to the number of fields where we can excel. Maybe large countries can aspire to lead in a variety of productive, technological, or political dimensions, while small ones simply cannot take that number of fields to try to excel on them. So could it be that the key for small countries lies, in fact, in their ability to correctly identify the places where they can succeed? So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. There are quite a few issues you raised there, and I think that the whole perception of size is something that we keep coming back to, and whether population and land has got anything to do with it at all. And maybe we should also be thinking about strategic positions and what kind of environment the small states actually that we're talking about live in. But without further ado, let me move over to Minister Frick, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Slovenia for this warm invitation. I love this place, and next time, for sure, I stay a couple of days longer here, and I'm sure my people have heard that to schedule my agenda for next year properly. Last year in September, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was visiting Liechtenstein, and he had a speech in front of about 500 Liechtensteiner, what is quite an amount in Liechtenstein. And in that speech he said, Liechtenstein may be one of the world's smaller countries, but its role is large. And please don't mistake me when I quote Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on this occasion. And of course we do think that a small size creates a lot of challenges, but we do believe as well that a small size creates a lot of opportunities as well. And of course, we do know that Liechtenstein cannot play a role in all the global affairs that big countries are dealing with. Nonetheless, small can be significant, and we do want to be significant, and we do want to add a real value in the world community. And therefore, I think Chile mentioned that as well, that therefore we have to set clear priorities and we have to select clear areas where we do think we can add values. And I think I have 5 minutes time, so I will give you just 2 examples where we try to add value, knowledge, and know-how. We are very actively engaged in a group that is called 3G. 3G stands for Global Governance Group. Among others, Slovenia is in the 3G group, and Chile is as well a member of this 3G group. In total, there are about 24 members in this 3G group, countries, and we do collectively think about the relation between the G20 and the UN and non-G20 members to the G20 members. And the success of this group is, among others, reflected in the fact that Singapore has been the convener of the meeting for the last couple of times, that Singapore has been invited to the last G20 summit and has been invited as well to the next G20 summit in November. So I think this gives a good signal that small states can be heard if they organize themselves properly, and if they try to really add a value, a constructive value in the discussion. And a second example I want to give you is the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Liechtenstein very actively engages ourselves in the area of international criminal justice and in the area of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is the central pillar in the international fight against impunity and the most serious crimes of international concern. And maybe some of you have probably heard that the states parties to the ICC reached a historic decision in the definition of the crime of aggression. And this historic decision they reached last June in Kampala, that's in Uganda. And I think it was a big step that the ICC at the end has the jurisdiction over that crime of aggression. And why do I mention this example? I mention the example because our ambassador to the UN, Christian Venneweser, has been chairing the State Parties Assembly. He has taken over the chair of the State Parties in the year 2008, and he has been chairing the ICC until this November, and he has been chairing this historic conference in Kampala. And this means we put a lot of effort. We have only 32 diplomatic people in our diplomatic service. And putting one people with a strong focus on the ICC means that we have a strong will to really add value in an area where we think we have know-how, where we have built know-how over the last couple of years, and where we think we can make a difference in the global world. Our strategy, and I mentioned that already, is to position Liechtenstein as a reliable, but as well as an engaged and active partner. And we want as well show solidarity doing all that in Europe and, of course, in the whole world as far as we can. Elements to implement our strategy is to set clear priorities. Central pillars of our foreign policies are the rule of law, are human rights, and I mentioned that international solidarity. We have to focus our resources. We only have 8 embassies and missions. That means that where we are in the countries where we are represented, we have to focus ourselves, and we have to decide very clearly where we want to be represented and what we do in these countries. And I think an important thing for Liechtenstein is Liechtenstein does not want to do everything, but what we do, we want to do right and to excel. Liechtenstein engages as a reliable and as an engaged partner. Liechtenstein can serve as a bridge between larger group of countries with different ideas, because we have a very neutral aspect and view on a certain kind of things, because Liechtenstein has in a lot of things no vested self-interest or political interest in things. This is because of our limited size, and accordingly its relatively limited number of our vested political interests, but also part because of our successful positioning as a credible partner and our credible engagement in several areas. Multilateral platforms, of course, are of big importance to Liechtenstein. They allow us to focus our resources very efficient and very strongly. Based on the sovereign equality of all the states, it allows all member states to participate on an equal footing and to have the same long stick as other countries have. One country, one vote, that's how it works, and where each country has the opportunity to make a real difference. So that's it a bit. I didn't finish with a question because I didn't know about a question, but I think there will be enough questions to rise afterwards.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Now we move on to Mr. Rocha, who will give us his presentation on, I'm sure he will give us a little bit of a flavor of what the issues are for Cape Verde.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like, first of all, to present greetings from Cape Verde to Slovenian authorities and people for their warm welcome and hospitality to this very beautiful place, to the participants of this panel for your kind attention and participation, and of course, to the special thanks to the organizing team. I have been asked to present the experience, to deliver the experience of Cape Verde, not as a small state, because, as it has been said, we are all equals in the international affairs concerning the sovereignty, but as a smaller state. Yes, Cape Verde is a smaller state. By the size of its territory, its land territory is only 4,033 square kilometers, dispersed in 9 inhabited islands out of 10 islands and 4 islets. But Cape Verde is also a large sea territory, about 730 square kilometers of sea. Our sea territory is larger than our land territory, and you are looking to extend our continental shelf beyond the 200,000 miles, which can give us a lot of other opportunities. Cape Verde is a smaller state also by the size of its population. According to our 2010 census, we are only 500,000 people living in the islands. But Cape Verde is part of a global nation because we estimate about 1 million Cape Verdean living abroad within a large geopolitical distribution across Europe, 300,000, across United States, 300,000, in South America like Brazil, in Argentina, and in continental Africa. And we have a large interaction between those living in the country and living abroad. And that makes Cape Verde a part of the global nation and not only an observer in the global affairs. Cape Verde is also its geostrategic location at the center of the Middle Atlantic Ocean with a wide perspective of connectivity to the world. About 3 hours to Brazil and South Lisbon, and South Europe, Lisbon, about 5 hours to New York and Middle Europe, about 50 minutes to the continental area, a hub for safe and modern maritime and air services, a multi-purpose tourism destination, and a security provider against transnational crime in the region. In this context, Cape Verde became an independent country in 1975. It has been a long journey, building a new state, playing governance a key role in political stability, vision for development, and democracy. Now we have an external policy giving to Cape Verde 3 main objectives: the affirmation of the global nation in the world, the promotion of peace and the global and regional security, and the achievement of the economic agenda for the transformation of the country. I want to elaborate on 2 points. We are a smaller state. We are asking ourselves if smaller states do have a position in global affairs, a power in global affairs. I would say that probably we don't have the military power, but we have the power of the example at the both national and international level, and the power of mutual accountability. What I mean by power of the example. Cape Verde is a rule of law, a democratic rule of law country. Even yesterday, we inaugurate the new president, which comes from a different political color from the prime minister, who is the chief executive. There is a cohabitation, and democracy is not only in the paper. It's a practice of the freedom in the papers, in the opinion, in the institution practices. And Cape Verde is quoted by many international institutions regarding international indicators. Transparency International about corruption, Heritage Foundation about economic freedom, and Ibrahim Index about Africa governance. In all these indicators, Cape Verde stays very high in the indicators to show how governance plays a key role as an example. Graduation. Cape Verde, since the independence, starts with $200 now per capita. Now we are talking about 3,000.5. And good governance is accountable for Cape Verde graduation out of the LDCs. Is the second example in the history that one country came out from the LDCs to start playing a role as a middle-income country. Cape Verde is also addressing the Millennium Development Goals challenge, and you are already, we achieved already 4 of them, and you are in the path to conclude most of them by 2015. Cape Verde also has a development vision and agenda. Good governance sustains Cape Verde's long-term vision to build a more inclusive, just, and prosperous nation. And today, we are building this in many clusters: tourism, a C cluster economy, air business, ITC cluster, modern agriculture, financial cluster, institutional and human building capacity. The power of the example at the international level. Cape Verde plays an active role in making multilateralism a key concept for democracy in global governance. It's why Cape Verde is part of different institutions at regional level, like African Union, ECOWAS. We start building on Micronesia. Micronesia is the group of all these archipelagos, like Cape Verde, Madeira, Canarias, and Azores, we have the same geographic and geo-ecological system. And this brings us to be part of a group. But Cape Verde is also part of the CPLP, the Portuguese community-speaking countries, and International Organization of the Francophonie. Cape Verde is elaborating a cooperative security in the region. We are developing our coastal guard with the US Navy, British Navy, Netherlands, Portugal, France, and many others. We are developing a sea maritime survey in order to fight all the illicit trafficking in that region, namely drug trafficking, impeding them to be in the region, but also to reach other parts like south of Europe. Cape Verde also advocates UN reform in order to make UN a worldwide representative body and a large Security Council to welcome smaller states aside with larger states to balance world interests in a more just rotation, representation, and diversity in nominations. In this context, Cape Verde was a non-permanent UN Security Council member in 1992, 1993, and probably, why not, we are going to present our candidacy in the next future. We have also, as I mentioned, the second point, the power of mutual accountability. We are developing a very dense bilateral relations network. Cape Verde has diplomatic relations with all countries in the world, almost all countries in the world. And this includes both larger and smaller states in Europe, North and South America, Africa and Asia, representing from the point of view of Cape Verde a community of mutual interest and support. Cape Verde also develops a full integration in the international system, following regional and international organizations. Cape Verde has specific alliance or groups as the World Bank Forum of Small States, the Association of Small Island States in Development, doing with environment, climate change, energy, and of course we are part of the Green Group that has been launched by Slovenia. Then we feel that being part of this regional integration, international organization, and this specific alliance or groups makes smallness a relative concept because we can interact with the different actors in the international arena. We have also the concept of special partnership. Cape Verde succeeded to have a special partnership with the European Union. We want to go beyond the Cotonou Agreement in order to probably would like to have with the European Union everything but institutions, which means that we are developing a lot of tools, not only in the governance, in the field of education, in the fields of normative and technical convergence, in the field of mobility and migration cooperation. Then, allow me just to conclude with final remarks. Are smaller states handicapped, having in mind the power of size, population, wealth, and other geographical, economic, financial, and environmental constraints that are related to the building of political and strategic position and influence in global affairs? Or because of their size, are smaller states more devoted to implement a cross-cutting and efficient policies that allow them to increase their relevance in international affairs? As the case of my country can point it out, smaller states show by their own good examples and credentials of political and economic governance that are relevant for their credibility and respect when they engage their national interest abroad. So, are they able to interact with bilateral networks, with regional and international organizations, and with ad hoc associations where, rather than being only beautiful, they are also useful for themselves and for others? Nevertheless, the question remains, to what extent the search for visibility, credibility, and recognition of their positions in defense of universal principles in one hand, and the promotion with results of their national interests in the other hand, should be considered, in the case of smaller states, evidence of power and ability to play an active role in the global affairs. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And thank you all panelists. I should have been more strict as moderator. Guess you all got to talk for 10 minutes, but that's okay. We'll make up for it now with short and precise questions and answers, right? I'd also like to mention, just since we don't have the foreign minister here of Iceland, what I find interesting, because we're now talking as small states, there always seems to be the question of trying to make up for being a small state, that we're all trying to give the story, the good story of being a small state. When we first opened the center in 2001, the center that I'm director for, the Center for Small State Studies in Iceland, the topic of actually talking about Iceland as a small state was highly controversial. The politicians would almost not take this word into their mouth. They wouldn't speak of Iceland as a small state. And I always found it so interesting, because how can we be anything but? Our population is 330,000. You know, so we don't even have a military. So it seems a bit strange, but this was always in the minds of people. You would have to talk about us as a little bit larger than that. Let's not put us down so much. But here, the feeling I get is that people are not concerned about categorizing themselves as small states. Maybe this has changed a little bit. I wonder, what do you think? Has the perception changed a little bit in the world about this? And also coming back to the issues that you're all bringing about with the sample, that actually small states can be role models and influential then probably in nonetheless limited areas. Certainly not as the larger states, and how they can play the whole field in international affairs, whereas I would think that small states need to be very selective, and you have to think very much about whatever national interests are behind. But nonetheless, from all three of you, I hear this thread where you speak about governance, where you speak about setting the example and the rule of law and human rights. So I'd like you all to elaborate a little bit on this, and also if anyone in the audience has any kind of questions or comments, please just raise your hand, or you can even write down questions on a piece of paper. Should we just start maybe by getting some feedback from our patient audience? Yes, please, sir. Would you like to state your name and your question?
My name is Walter Lichem. I've been ambassador to Chile and have been involved in global affairs for many years. I'm working on a Canary Current program right now with UNEP and UNIDO. But small power foreign policy is a topic that has interested me for many years. And I remember a discussion in The Hague with Boutros Ghali some years ago when we discussed what are the small countries really, the smaller countries in the foreign policy approach really facing. And Boutros Ghali meant there are two dimensions. One is to negotiate, they only need one person. And the other one is to know what to negotiate. And he felt there was a contradiction between the growing complexity of our global agenda and the capacity to address it. In his opinion, he said this, he said, at least 130 member countries of the United Nations do not know what to do. I'm sorry to quote him there, but the challenge is, and I've been involved in the creation of the Human Security Network, which I regret to see is somehow been withering away a little bit. But a key task for small power unions would not only be to join up numbers of votes, but to develop a capacity to address the global agenda. And just a last remark, if I may, see the key difference between small powers and big powers, at least the courses I've been teaching, is that big powers have the capacity to pursue national interests. Small powers see their national interests safeguarded by the preservation of the common good. And this is why their policy is focused on the common good. And this is why they are ideal actors on the global scene. And I always quote, in admiration, Liechtenstein's role, Ambassador Verde, who out of nothing became a lead person in New York and was employed by the Secretary General, by the President of the General Assembly for all difficult tasks, not to speak of Chile or Costa Rica or Mali or Jordan. The small countries, in fact, are playing a key role in moving the agenda on. My question would be to you, how do we enhance the substantive capacity to address the ever more complex agenda? Thank you.
Should we get a few more comments and then we'll move on to the panel? Yes, Maria.
I come from another small country, Luxembourg, that has been mentioned by the minister from Chile as a good example. My name is Mario Hirsch. I'm presently Senior Research Fellow at the European Union Institute for Security Studies in Paris, but I have a long career, including governmental and diplomatic career. I would suggest that we get away a little from the idealistic undertone that has dominated the presentation so far. I don't question this, but I think the use of the term power in connection with especially the very small states is misleading. So I suggest we should rather use the term influence. I coined, by the way, that expression in a Chatham House publication. Influence without power was the title of the article, and that is still being quoted as a good illustration of the clout, because it's really a question of the clout smaller countries can have. Influence without power does not mean that you have to give in on any and every occasion. You have to be tough from time to time. The example of my country is a good illustration for that. We share together with Liechtenstein a fate that we have been the victims of what I would call a name and shame campaign 2 years ago by the G20, pointing fingers at us because of our supposed role as tax haven. So there you can see that small countries or smaller countries are vulnerable, basically, and they have to do something about that. Not let the others, the bigger ones, play games with them.
Thank you very much. There's one question over here as well, and then we'll move on to getting reactions from the panelists.
Thank you. Paul Fritsch from the OSCE. We're privileged to host one of the 8 embassies and missions that Minister Frick mentioned, and I can testify to both the opportunities that a multilateral organization like the OSCE offers to small states, and at least with regard to Liechtenstein and Iceland, to the very important and very constructive role that small states can play within a framework like the OSCE. But I wanted to raise 2 issues that haven't been touched upon by the panel. We have in the OSCE community a very particular class of small states, or smaller states, that includes our hosts here in Slovenia, that includes our chairmanship in Lithuania, of small states who have gained their sovereignty and independence relatively recently, and then turned around and voluntarily given part of it up in order to join the European Union, which is a particular path that is not represented on the panel. And then we have another class of those who would like very badly to join the states represented on the panel, but can't. We have at least 6 entities across the OSCE area, ranging in size and in progress toward legitimacy and recognition, from Kosovo with 2 million people and 35 OSCE participating states recognizing its independence, to places like South Ossetia with 10, perhaps 15,000, and only one country recognizing its independence. And these states also seem to exert a certain amount of power or influence, but it seems to be the power to tie up the time, political attention, and resources of the big states. And we spend a disproportionate amount of time wrestling with the problem of how to deal with the wannabe small states that are not gaining traction toward legitimacy. And I was wondering if there were any perspectives on the panel as to how we might find new approaches to deal with those challenges.
Thank you very much. I think we'll try to move into some answers now and comments from the panels. Is there anyone that would like to start? And, yes, Minister Frick.
I start a bit with the first question you had, how we see our countries and how we see ourselves positioned. I would like to start with a quote from a politician, and it's a quote from about 1848, something around that, so it's quite an old quote. And that Liechtenstein politician said, Liechtenstein is a small population, a small country that deserves respect from everybody, but that is to danger to nobody. And I think that gives a bit the feeling how we still today from a Liechtenstein company worldwide, what I do personally believe is an amazing number, so somewhere in here must be sitting some artificial tools must be sitting in here, I assume, or that steering elements from cars, from every fifth modern car in Europe comes from a Liechtenstein company called ThyssenKrupp Presta. So I think small countries, we are not arrogant. We know we are small and we are very small in size, but there are some types of power, not only influence, I think, we have, and I think it's okay to lift that as well. And in relation, just to go a bit to another subject, the multilateral organizations were mentioned, and of course multilateral organizations are of huge importance for a country like Liechtenstein, and I mentioned that in my keynote at the beginning as well. And we have a huge self-interest as well that these multilateral organizations are working properly, and that's as well a bit the reason why Liechtenstein has a strong focus on the developments, on the reform of the Security Council, that the UN is working fast, and that there is no shift from the UN as a multilateral platform to a world economic government such as the G20. That is the reason, not only, but as well, why we strongly engage in the reforms of the Security Council, just to give one example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think it's also the issue of, or let me pose to you, that small states tend to search for shelter. That maybe you cannot really imagine a smaller state standing on its own, that you need the shelter of being part of an international organization, or that you need to participate with other countries in a multilateral kind of an, setting.
Yeah. Well, I think that the three of us have very similar approaches to the problem. And somebody said here that we have a somewhat kind of idealistic approach. Maybe we were not really understood. It is much better to be larger, to have more resources, than to be smaller and have fewer ones. Even with the fact that many larger states have to put a lot of effort in keeping big, in keeping the population together. There's a lot of effort on that when you come from different type of populations and different cultures among the same country. But the point is that the new situation of the world makes us better off. It is better to have this world where you have all these organizations, this multilateral diplomacy, where you can, in your own words, shelter on international law, in a lot of international arrangements that will not completely, but in a large degree, protect smaller states. Then there was the question of how do we get to be important in that field, in this global agenda? Well, there were a couple of names that were named all around. The 3G group, the human security group, which are in fact what? A few countries that have similar ideas that are from very different continents, very different locations in the world, but because they have similar ideas and they were to push them, then they come together and try to push their ideas, and they are very successful. Those two groups, for example, are something that you have to look on. You mentioned the case of Singapore being at the G20 just because it is the head of the 3G. And in the case of the human security, for example, all the facts about cluster bombs and all that has been pushed by that group and has been very successful. And we have a lot of problems to face. I was hearing you from Cabo Verde, which you said that one of the main advantages of Cabo Verde was the geographical location at the center of the ocean, and also to have a larger sea, much larger sea than the territory. So I assume that fishing should be something important, as it is in the case of Iceland. And how do we get across? That's the same case of Chile. We have a very large coast. How do we get to solve the problem that fishing resources are inside and outside the 200-mile zone? And we need to have an international agreement that can protect those fishing resources. Otherwise, the advantage in the field of fishing of having a very large sea will be completely destroyed, as it is the case today. And so that's another field, another arena where getting together, as a lot of countries we are trying to do, can have a large advantage in that. In the case of Liechtenstein, you told us that one of the main advantages that you didn't have any vested interest in many subjects. So, and I hear from many of the people present here that you have made a very large contribution on international arena because of that. So there's the second point. We really have some comparative advantages, and we can work on that. You can have 35,000 inhabitants and be very important in international arenas, as it is your case. And that's amazing if you concentrate your resources.
Yes, thank you, Madam. The question has been raised here about power or influence. I wouldn't say that this question is just a semantic one. If we go to political science, where you have the realistic school or the idealistic school, I must say that when I come to talk about smaller states and to mention the power of the smaller states, I must be neither realistic nor idealistic, but pragmatic. And being pragmatic, a country like Verde, when we come to independence, our main goal was to survive, taking account all the concerns that we did have at that moment. But I'm fully in agreement with what you said about Mr. Boutros Ghali, that I know very well because I've been working with him personally for 4 years, and then I learned about a lot with him. When I took the floor before, I mentioned the power of the example, because we are all friendly countries, but above all we have interests, national interests, and we small countries want to preserve, as you said, our national interests, but giving good examples. I mentioned democracy, I mentioned graduation, but for instance now, in the framework of UN reform, Cape Verde, as a small country, is paying a good example of a reform, very important reform in the UN, the Delivering as One program. The Delivering as One is how the United Nations, all the agencies of the United Nations, instead of competing one against the other, they can integrate their resources in one program, one budget, one coordination to deliver better the program. And Cape Verde is one of the 8 pilot countries doing this experience of one, delivering as one. In the regional context, for instance, we welcome different conferences to fight against drug in the region within the ECOWAS. We also promoting peace, the reform of the security sector with Guinea-Bissau, because we want as the common good for our region as peace and security. Without peace and security, we cannot have all this sea territory being maritime, aerial, safe, and a touristical destination safe that can bring us the research that we do need for our own development. We can also, Cape Verde also as a small country is developing ITC. ITC with very rich applications in e-governance, e-business, and now we are starting with e-education and telemedicine. E-governance is something that many countries in Africa comes to see the experience of Cape Verde and how they can implement them, because now we have an integrated. Our Minister of Finance can monitor the budget online, daily basis, because we have an information management system covering all the country and providing the information through the different public assets. That's the idea of being, not, as I said, I repeat, not only beautiful as a small, but useful for, as a small, we can present some experience and some points where we can participate in the global affairs and not to be only an observer. Just to conclude with a joke, when God distributed the world, he created China, United States, and Europe and so on. And then looking behind, God looked and saw Cape Verde Islands. And said, who are you guys? What are you doing here? And we said, we are just going with them. But now we want to be more than going with them. We want also to work and to be part of all these global affairs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But then I wonder if setting a good example and being a good role model, does that actually mean that you are influential? So coming back to that a little bit, we'll think about it a little bit. See if we have any more questions or comments from the audience. Yes, please. Over there.
Good morning. My name is Michael Putz. I'm the Ambassador of Australia in Vienna. First of all, I want to reassure you that Australia is not seeking to redefine itself as a smaller country, but we are surrounded on at least 3 sides by smaller countries on the Pacific Ocean side, in Southeast Asia, and on the Indian Ocean side. And I want to pick up from those countries one aspect of the discussion on multilateral diplomacy, which wasn't fully addressed, although our colleague from Cabo Verde certainly made an allusion to it, and it's the role of regional multilateral bodies. In the Pacific region, I'm thinking particularly of the Pacific Islands Forum, but in the Caribbean, certainly there's a Caribbean community, the CARICOM. And I think at least those two, and probably others as well, enable a range of smaller states to realise their personality on the international field in a way that just individual bilateral representations don't facilitate. And my point is simply to draw attention to them, and I think to other analogous organisations, and to make the point that certainly in the Pacific at least, our neighbours work well when they work together in these bodies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we have some samples from this in Iceland, of course, as well, so I'll just mention that. With the Nordic countries, the Nordic small states, there's quite a bit of cooperation on the regional level, and even with the Baltic states, so it's good to mention. Thank you so much. Yes?
Thank you. My name is David Bunker. I'm Swiss, also a small country. I'm representing the International Organization of the Francophonie, that means 56 countries and government. I just have a little question, especially for Liechtenstein. Does still national currency mean something for small states?
It's a highly sensitive issue in Iceland as well, but Yeah, we'll do one more and then we'll come to panel.
Only a very quick question on the British ambassador, and like the Australian, I don't wish to posit that Britain is a small state either, although we do have England surrounded by Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, which are smaller, and some of which have some aspirations for a greater level of independence. I really wanted to come back to what I thought was an excellent question from my OSCE colleague sitting behind me, and ask the panel to respond on that. And I just wanted to add to a question from the Francophonie that, of course, Britain has the Commonwealth as well, which unites over 50 countries, many of which are small. And it's not a regional organization exactly. I guess it's a kind of throwback to empire. But I'd be interested to know the comments of those on the panel as to how much value those organizations can have, which entrench very strong historical and friendship values, lots of people-to-people contact, sporting contacts, and so on. Thank you.
Very good. Yes, we'll move over to the panel. We'll start with Mr. Rocha now. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. The Australian government is inviting Cape Verde to participate in an international conference next October to address the question of the development of the smaller states around Australia. It's because they want to listen to the experience of Cape Verde from where you are in the Atlantic to where you are in the Oceanic. About regional organization, I must say that we must take into consideration that regional organization do not necessarily mean geographical close countries. Quoting Mr. Boutros Ghali, he said there are three kinds of international organization. There are the universal, there are the regional, and there are the cultural. And then we come to address Commonwealth, Francophonie, CPLP as cultural organization that can gather together different countries from different parts of the world because they share from the same perspective of linguistic and cultural assets, they can do politics. And it's why being part of this regional, not geographical organization is one way where smaller states can play a role. And in the case of Cape Verde, we are part of the Portuguese-speaking countries communities, which we are only 8, but we do have Brazil in it, and then plus Portugal, Angola, Mozambique, and so on. And, of course...
We have been using the Swiss francs. And honestly, up to now, and I still keep saying that, Liechtenstein is very happy having a contract with Switzerland to use the Swiss franc. And until a very short period of time ago, we were very happy about the strength of a currency like the Swiss francs. And always I said that we have a financial center, of course you know, we always said that part of the strength of our financial center is that we have a political stability and that we have the Swiss franc that is a very stable, hard currency. But do we need an own currency to be a sovereign state? I would answer no. I'm not sure about my answer, to be honest. I was thinking about my answer, what I would say. I think we don't need an own currency to be a sovereign state. But of course, now, with the very strong Swiss franc and with all the developments in the last couple of months, we suffered as well. I mean, we suffered together with Switzerland. Our industry suffered together with the Swiss industry. And what I do personally believe we had quite an advantage in is that Liechtenstein almost only produces highly technologized, highly specialized products. So in most of the cases, having a higher price, they could still survive and sell it by higher price. So our industry up to now, touch wood, we had the chance to not having a higher unemployment rate, but of course we are happy that the National Bank has taken measures, has taken action, and of course we are following with quite some concern about the developments. But I think my answer would be a no. And I think there was a second answer. Can I go to this power and influence thing quickly?
Go ahead.
Or do I bring you out of the concept now?
No, it's fine.
Yeah. I just wanted to say one thing that always arises. Does a small state has power, or do we have an influence, or are we only being influenced? That was some question that came from somewhere here. And I think there are two two sides of the coin to that answer. I mean, I just give you one example. Of course, we are under influence from the big states. I'm Minister of Justice as well, and we have a strong pressure from the international organizations that we should not be allowed any longer to have owner shares. So the shares of a company should only be shares with the name on it, because it's easier to track the ownership, etc. So it's all in this money laundering aspects. And they put quite some pressure on Liechtenstein to immediately stop to have owner shares in Liechtenstein any longer. But looking all over Europe, there are a lot of countries, not only in our neighborhood, a lot of countries in Europe that have the concept of owner shares still, and they don't feel the same pressure like we have. So I currently have the pressure to say within months I should change the law at home, and we should stop to have that. And of course we have thousands of these kind of shares. And for us, as well politically in Liechtenstein, it's a very tough thing to do. And other countries have the same concept of shares and they don't have the pressure. So I think it's fair as well to admit that small countries have some kind of pressure because we don't have the protection of like big neighbors or big powers that put their hands around us and say, it's okay here. So I think it's fair to admit there is influence from big states or bigger circles and organizations on small states. And still on the other side, we think, and that's why here I'm coming a bit back to what I said at the beginning, we can move things. For example, we are strongly engaged in the reforms of the Security Council. And Liechtenstein submitted with the name of Liechtenstein one paper how the Security Council could be reformed. And it's no rocket science, it's nothing completely new, but Liechtenstein put it on a paper and we submitted it. And now in the UN, they are looking at the paper Liechtenstein submitted because it's no self-interest. Liechtenstein won't ask for a security seat, for a non-permanent seat in the Security Council, I would say, for the next 20 years. So there is no self-interest, and we have a very neutral and reliable and objective position to put in papers to find solutions. So I would say there are two sides of the answers to the question, are we only being influenced or can we have an influence and is only power on us, or do we have a certain kind of limited power?
Exactly. Thank you so much. Would you also like to comment on the question about recognizing the entities that want independence, and if we actually have, as a small states, a role in that, being able to help them?
I think it is a difficult question coming on these kind of things. I think recognizing countries and independence. We were quite strong, for example, on Kosovo. So we were among the first countries recognizing, or not the first, but among the first, I would say, I don't know, first dozen of ones that recognized Kosovo. So we were quite early on that. But I think we are a small country. We only have 8 embassies and missions outside. So often we have to rely on information we get from our neighbor countries, from our friend countries, to know what to have the right information, etc. So in the example of Palestine, of course we wait on what Palestine is going to do in the next couple of weeks during the General Assembly in the UN, and then we will decide. But of course we will liaise very closely with the EU, with neighboring countries who can give us good information.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also wanted to mention, like I mentioned before, with recognizing the Baltic states, that's something that Iceland was actually in the forefront of doing, and I think that that has always also been an issue for Iceland to actually follow that kind of a policy. Mm-hmm. Mr. Moreno, would you like to comment?
Yes, I would like to take the question about regional agreements and organization, which is something very important for small states. It was already mentioned that they are not necessarily geographical. There are a lot of geographical ones, but are also some of them which are based on culture or just on common interest. And they are very, very important for small states. And of course they help, and they give weight and they give influence for small states to have a word on what's happening on the global arena. The point is, what do you include on that? And there are some political ones, there are some economic ones. The example of the EU, for example, is something that, of course, regional organizations should look at and see what are the good experiences of that and what are the bad ones. And because we're lagging behind what Europe has done in a lot of aspects. And that gets me to the national currency. The problem in Europe with the national, the euro, is not very far away from what smaller states have had to suffer for many, many years with fixed exchange rates. There was economic policy for many, many years saying that fixed exchanges were the tool for controlling inflation. And because of that, many countries assumed that that was the best policy. And when they got an external shock, the results of the adjustment were very, very slow. Unemployment went very up, and the results were very damaging. And so we are not far from that in the case of Europe, where you got the same currency and you cannot adjust through the evaluation. So if you're making a regional organization and you're getting into economics on that, you're making a common market, let's say, so the economic measures and the laws of economics will work. So all the arrangements that you do must be something something that will work. If you're going to have a common currency, then try to be a part of that country. Maybe you will remain having a sovereign state, as you were saying, but I'm sure you will not have the same economic ability to change things. Otherwise, you can have a very different path of growth between those two countries, the one that has the currency and the one that is using it. And the results can be very damaging for any adjustment to any external shock. So there are states, like the United States of America, states with congresses, with a lot of powers at the state level. They have a common currency, but on the other hand, they have a lot of things that they have gone to the central government. So I think that regional agreements are something very useful for smaller states in all of these fields, but we have to be very careful of where we are using our efforts, both on the political arena, also on the economic one. In the political arena, there are a lot of organizations that do not work and do not behave and do not make any clear advancement, any clear good thing. So as a smaller state, you have to choose where you're putting your efforts.
Yeah, that is so true. Mario, would you like to comment? Yes.
I feel both the British ambassador and the OSCE representative are frustrated because the question they raised has not been answered. I will try to give a short answer. Now,
go ahead.
The European Union's policy is now not to recognize any country that has border conflicts or territorial disputes with its neighbors.
Except the one inside the European Union.
Yes, of course, because, no, it is precisely because of the Cyprus example that we learned the lesson. So that is as a general rule, and I think that will answer your question about the situation.
But the question was not really so much about recognition. Yeah. The question was about all of us recognizing the fact that there's not going to be any recognition in the foreseeable future. And are there any steps short of that, that experiences that small states can share with the entities on ways to integrate themselves socially and economically into the broader community in order to find a way around these political deadlocks that suck so much of our time and our energy and our resources?
But may I remind you also, and that goes a little in line with what you are really interested in. In the beginning of the 90s, Luxembourg happened to be presiding over the European Union, and the Luxembourg foreign minister openly questioned the independence of Croatia, stating that Croatia was too small to become a viable, independent country. Now, this coming from Luxembourg, if you compare Luxembourg to Croatia, this was, by the way, also the man who said this is the hour of Europe regarding what became the Yugoslav conflicts. So there you can see how relative things are. It's always a question of appreciation of the context and so on.
Yeah, I'm sorry for misunderstanding that, but the whole idea, what I wanted to pose was, is that actually a step that small states can then help by recognizing and trying to push the process forward? Yes?
Just a comment on this. In 1968, St. Lucia presented its application for membership in the United Nations. Utant, who had just some years earlier created UNITA as what he wanted to be the think tank of the United Nations. So the first study UNITA did was a study on mini-states. And there were two options. We admit them, they swarm into the General Assembly and outvote us, or we force them to unite regionally. So you have the Caribbean community as one member in the United Nations. Interestingly enough, that UNITA study came to the conclusion, no, everyone should be a sovereign member. I'm sorry, just a historical reference.
Thank you so much. Yes, there's a comment here in the back.
Thank you. I'm the ambassador
of
Cyprus. Just, of course, I would like to make, just to stress the point, I'm sure that always is aware that by recognizing this notion, recognizing states, there are states, different cases, and you are all aware. Some of them are results of aggression and occupation. Some of them are just the will for independence. So, I mean, we must be very careful about this notion of recognizing entities, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I also think there is a point to be made for the possible role that small states can play as negotiators, as intermediaries, as even in issues of difficult conflict resolutions. We have many, of course, samples of this. I may refer to Norway as one. So this is some niche capability that actually small states can try to work on. I think that's what I was alluding to. Any other comments or questions before we get some reactions from the panel? Okay. Would anyone like to comment on these issues just being brought up? Yes, Mr. Rocha?
The power of smaller states to carry out negotiations or intermediation, it is something which is relative, depending on the relations you have with the other side. In the case of Cape Verde, I can mention two examples. We have a very close ties with Guinea-Bissau because our just a former president who left yesterday used to be a fighter in the Guinea-Bissau context, and knowing very well the people in the country was almost all time called to make intermediation and to help things happening. The other is, as Cape Verde show an example of being a politically stable country, well-governed, having a democratic rule of law government for a long period, Cape Verde can give this example, and it's why, in the context of regional organization like ECOWAS, Cape Verde has been requested to be part of panels that were sent to Côte d'Ivoire, to others, to make this kind of of negotiation to try to bring peace and to bring stability. About recognition, I must say that there is a difference between application and recognition. Of course, you have this special committee in the framework of decolonization that was taking care of independence. But now you have only some residual situation that are probably Palestine, Western Sahara, and so on. But you have new situations that are existing now from the former Yugoslavia and others. And of course, in this context, the United Nations present an independent country, present his application to be recognized as member. And there is a vote by the General Assembly. But the recognition of countries still remains a political decision by individual countries. It's why, let's take an example, you have now the Kosovo, where the government of Kosovo is approaching different governments in order to request the recognition. It is something that, in the case of Cape Verde, of course, the constitution of Cape Verde recognized the right for people for self-determination and independence in following the international law, which means that the decision remains a political decision to recognize. But when a country comes to be recognized by a majority of states and presenting its application to the UN, probably recognition can become application for member states. It's why it's very important to make a distinction between the two situations. Thank you.
And moving on to you, would you like to comment on this, Minister Frick? No. Okay. Minister Moreno? No. They have nothing further to say. But I wonder then, when we're looking at the whole issue of size, we're talking smaller states, we're talking larger states, and we're all in recognition, I think, of that compared to the largest states, most states in the world are actually small. So we're talking about a majority of states in the world and how we need to set an example and how we need to have good governance to be able to have any influence. In the end, though, when we're talking the big issues of global affairs, do we have any power? It's the big question now. Yes, go ahead.
The classification among large state and small state do not make countries to have the same interests or the same political ideas or the same economic interests or whatever. So to unite a group of countries to make something, you need to have a common idea or a common interest. So just the fact of being smaller than China or the US does not make any common thing among those countries. So from what we had heard here, the point is that what do we have in common? The thing that we have in common is that we are better off working through multilateral organizations than the bilateral ones because we're small. So that's one thing that we have in common. We're better off using international law instead of using the armed forces because we are small. So we have some things that we have in common, but on the other fields, if we are from the left or from the right, that doesn't depend on the size of the country. Do we believe in open economies or closed ones? It depends on what do you think on other subjects very different from small states. I think that small states must support multilateral organizations, must make a lot of efforts to use multilateral agreements, regional, cultural, based on specific subjects or specific ideas, to push their own interest and their own ideas on the global arena. Otherwise, because of being small, they will not be able to go through with them. And these common interest groups can be in many different fields. We already heard about many of them and here. And you have to focus. You have to focus your efforts because the resources are small. and you have to put them where really the national interest is and where you can really make a difference. So I would say that the sense of smaller state as a whole making something that I think you will not see unless it is the support for the system of international organizations making the big decision instead of powerful and big states making their decisions on their own. So, for example, military intervention on countries. I think we have to push on what we have seen on the last years. Instead of a country deciding something, Security Council, maybe in some years more, we have a different arrangement at the UN, and the deciding body will be a different one, or maybe the members could be different, or the way that decisions will be taken will be different. But even with that, the fact that there is a group of countries that must say that this is a correct thing to do is quite different from having just one or two that decide it.
Thank you so much. Minister Frick?
Thank you. Just to continue to what Alfredo said, of course we do hope that the Security Council will be in a different setting in a couple of years from now, and personally I do hope that India at one stage will be sitting in some position on a non-permanent member, on an elected member, whatever, but that these countries will have the possibility to be sitting in the Security Council. Basically, I agree with what Alfredo has said, but I as well believe that smallness does not mean that all the small countries have the same interest, and the same thing is right for all the small countries just because we are small. Switzerland, of course, is a lot bigger than we are. But looking on the European integration, Liechtenstein is in the EEA, Switzerland has bilateral agreements, and both countries are not the biggest countries in Europe. And I think it does not mean two countries that are relatively, Switzerland is a lot bigger, to say it again, it does not mean that the integration is the same for each country, and the same is right for each country. Or looking on San Marino or Monaco and integration of these countries, this does not mean because they have a similar size like Liechtenstein or a bit bigger than we are, and the same integration is right for them. And it does not per se mean that every small country has a problem with integration just because we are small. So I think putting in on a very diversified level what is right for each country is as well the right aspect to look on small countries. And of course, Alfredo said it, Liechtenstein has no military to send to any other countries because we want to fight for our interests, and we don't have policemen enough to send anywhere to fight for our interests, so we have to do it through the multilateral platforms where we have the floor, where we can communicate with a group of people, of countries that have similar interests to us. And that's why our foreign policy has a strong focus on this multilateral organization where we can find like-minded groups to have a certain kind of power.
Can I just to add a couple of subjects where I think that the common interest lies also on smaller states. Not only multilateral organizations, but also free trade. There is all of us, small countries, have small markets, and one of the biggest risks that we have is protectionism. And if the big countries impose large barriers, what will happen is that our economies will suffer a lot. So if we can have world or regional or whatever agreements that make us able to compete on those markets, I think the smaller states could be much better than on a different arrangement where every economy is on its own. And so that's one. The other one is democracy and human rights, which at the end are also related with war and military, and so there is some aspect of that which also gives more stability and a larger defense for smaller countries if we are in a world where, for example, you mentioned the crime of aggression. So if we're able to obtain that so that everybody ratifies the treaty, and we already have that definition of the crime of aggression, so I think that small countries are better off with that, with the international tribunal taking that crime of aggression, that what we were before.
Thank you very much. I believe, like globalization, smaller countries must think global, even they have to act local, which means that smaller countries, they have to look, as it has been said, to preserve their interests and to look for common interests. You mentioned trade. It's true, trade. But now, for instance, the OCS is defending the climate change threats against the small countries, and most of them islands, which is completely different from other big countries. Then I believe there are common group of interests where in different groups, the smaller countries can integrate different groups to pursue their specific interests, depending in one area or another. That is very important for the smaller states. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's see if there are any questions or comments from the audience at this point. Any specific areas you'd like us to touch upon before we round this off? Well, it seems like we have exhausted the topic. That's very strange. I thought we could talk about small states forever. Let me leave you with a little example of the power of a small state, if I may. It came to mind last year when we had the volcanic eruption in Iceland that there was actually incredible power coming from one small state, being able to stop the air transport all over the world. So maybe that's where the power and the influence lies. If we'd like to wrap this up now, if you have any further comments you'd like to bring towards the end, you have about, well, you actually have a few minutes since we have some time left. So I'll start with you, Mr. Moreno, and then we move on.
Well, just to add that we also have volcanoes, so maybe the common thing, and we also have an eruption, and we made a lot of problems for Argentina. Even Australia and New Zealand had a problem with their airlines and other things, so we're sorry for that. But and
what can we say?
What can we say? So if you focus on volcanoes, you can be an enormous power in the world. You can even stop everything for a couple of days. No, just to summarize, multilateral organizations, common interest groups, which can be regional, which can be political, which can be cultural, whatever is in line with the national interest and the national resources and the things that we feel that we can make really a difference on the world. And because those are very few things, because being a small state, you do not have resources to push everything. I think that the power of focusing the efforts is enormous. It's a necessity. And I would like also not to understate that the future of any small state will not lie, even with that, on multilateral organization. There is no multilateral organization that will solve neither the problem of independence of a country, neither the problem of the economic well-being, neither the problem of having a political stability. All those things at the end lie on each country. And what will happen with the small countries will depend on their own governments, their own population, and their own policies. And as I gave you some examples, if you look some years ago, some of the very good examples of today of very high income per capita or whatever, highly developed countries. They were not many years ago. Just remember that England was the colonial power at the U.S., and maybe if you compare today the U.S. with England, well, the difference today is large, very large, but on the other side. And I gave you the example of Chile, for example, against Haiti, which now you have the poorest country, and the other one is the highest income per capita today, and they were just the opposite not many, many years ago, if you take world history. And so what will happen, it depends on all of us. It depends on what do you do, and the difference can be enormous. If you look any country a few years ago, what they did and the end results, they get quite apart, coming from the same size, the same regional location, and whatever, the results can be very different. And even some of the advantages that have some countries, they change over time. Just to give you the example of Chile. Chile, before the Panama Canal, was a maritime power because everybody has to go through the Magallanes Strait. And Valparaiso, the main port, was a fantastic port. There were a lot of English people and many Europeans going there. Trade was very, very big. Today, that's a common heritage city because of what happened at those days. But then came the Panama Canal, and it disappeared completely. So you have to be aware that some of the advantages can change, and they can change very fast. So I think there is no way to go ahead as the effort, intelligence, and good policies of every country.
Thank you. Is it fine if I add one thought instead of wrapping up? Is that fine? Yeah. I have one thought we didn't really touch, and that's the thought, if we talk about countries that are small in size and small in power and that have no natural resources like we are, and we don't have a volcano or any natural power in Liechtenstein.
And no fish in the sea.
Yeah, no fishery and no fishery problems. I think sometimes it's important to look at numbers and to count per capita. And Liechtenstein, I said at the beginning of my keynote speech that for Liechtenstein, solidarity is an important aspect in our foreign policy. And if I mention in here the number of 26.6 million Swiss francs we spend per year for humanitarian aid, you might think that this number is not too high. But for Liechtenstein, it means that last year we reached this ODA percentage of 0.6%, and we hopefully will reach 0.7%, I mean, as soon as we can, but in the next couple of years or whatever, how the developments will be. So sometimes when we talk about small countries, sometimes it's right as well to talk in a per capita aspect. That's what I wanted to add, and one funny example to finish would be, I think Liechtenstein is the country that has the biggest number of Olympic medals per capita. And I think that's always a funny thing.
Mr. Rocha?
Thank you very much, Madam. In Cape Verde, we do have a volcano. The last eruption was in 1995, but it's a volcano that has a local impact. It doesn't have impact in the region or in the world. But it's still there, and times to times we have to pay attention because we can see some smokes, it can movements. But Cape Verde, as a smaller state, it's a smaller and developing state, which is a little bit different from Liechtenstein. We want to rely on our national interests to promote peace and security regionally and internationally, because we want to develop as a service provider in the maritime navigation and security, aerial navigation and security, and also what I can say, the security tout court, in the fact that we are fighting against all trafficking going around. Because one of the main resources of the country is tourism. Now we want to have 3 tourists per capita. We have just 1 per capita now. We are promoting to have 3 per capita. And then we want to present our country as a safe country, a reliable country, is why we have political stability, we have democratic governance, and we have an economic agenda that we want to promote, and we must rely on international environment, and the fact that being a smaller state, we can play a role in the global affairs in order to bring these resources to the country. I thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Just to summarize in short, I think we've said it all quite a few times, but nonetheless the common thread seems to be that setting a good example is a way to go for small states, to be able to be influential, working on the regional level. The multilateral diplomacy is another issue that came up, the issue of human rights, and there, by setting a good example and promoting democracy. I think that if we all manage to do this, we will certainly live in a better world, that's for sure. Let these be the last words of the panel. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you all for being here today.
You missed one on the conclusions, very important one. You need a volcano.
Oh, that's true. Thank you.